All right, so in the last video, the Ming Dynasty had fallen, right? Because it was weakened, and it was had a series of bad emperors. And then you had that rebellion by the peasant named Li, right, which weakened it further, allowing the Manchus, these outside invaders, to come in. And as I said, at least the Manchus had a Chinese style of government. They already had Chinese working within their government and within their military. Yet, for many Chinese, this was still unacceptable because the Manchus are outsiders. Therefore, they're barbarians. Right? So they're going to resist the Manchus, or what becomes known as the Qing dynasty, because they are outsiders. Li will escape and continue to fight. There will be other Chinese generals that will continue to fight and try to become emperors themselves. So they had a very large territory that they had to subdue. So the Qing, ever practical, came up with an easy way to spot the rebels. They said that all Chinese men now had to wear their hair in a queue. Right? It's pronounced queue, which is a hairstyle, traditional Manchu hairstyle. Right? And so they said you have to wear your hair in this Manchu hairstyle to prove that you are loyal to the Manchus. Right? So it was the forehead was shaved, and then the rest of the hair was braided into basically a pigtail. Right? It looked like that, where the forehead is shaved and then a long pigtail, right? It's called a queue. And if you did not wear your hair in a queue, right, they would execute you. They would behead you. There was a phrase, better to lose your hair than lose your head, right? Because the idea was if you won't follow this one rule about your hair, if you won't have your hair in this traditional Manchu hairstyle, then you're never going to be loyal to the Manchu. So we just need to go ahead and take care of you. And before you ask, the Chinese men already wore their hair long, so that part's not a problem. They just had to shave the top of their forehead and wear that braid. Interestingly enough, centuries later, in the 1900s, when the Qing dynasty collapses, many Chinese men will resist not wearing their hair in a queue because eventually this Manchu hairstyle becomes essentially a Chinese hairstyle, and it takes years, but eventually they subdue all of China. And for your average peasant, it didn't really matter to them who was on the throne, right? Because they're not going to have any interactions with them anyway. They care about, is my harvest going to be good, right? Are we going to have floods this year? Is there going to be a drought this year? So for your average Chinese person, as long as their taxes weren't too high and the crops were good, they're going to be okay with it. So the Qing, if you remember, they already had a government based on a Chinese model, right? So it was easy for them to make that transition. So they kept the civil service exams based on Confucianism, for instance, right? And then what they did is the highest ranking positions, of course, went to Manchus, but right beneath them, they filled the government full of ethnic native Chinese. This is exactly what Akbar did with the Mughals in the Mughal Empire, where he filled the high ranking positions with Mughals that he could trust, but then he filled many positions with native Hindus. You give them a say so in the government. Same thing in the Qing system, and it proved to be very effective, or it would have been. But at first, many scholars resisted taking the civil service exams to work for the Qing, because remember, the Qing are not Chinese; they're outsiders, they're Manchurians. Now, they had a lot of Chinese ways about them, but they still wanted to maintain their unique cultural identity. So, for instance, the Manchus, like in Beijing, there was a Manchu section of Beijing, and only Manchus could live there. A Manchu could only marry another Manchu to try to maintain their unique cultural identity. Now, the longer the Manchus stayed in China, the less they're able to do that. It's human nature. You have the tendency to adapt and to adopt the culture that surrounds you. So, given a couple of centuries, the Qing and the Chinese, they become very, very, very similar. So we come to the reign of one of the Qing emperors, a guy named Kongzhi, who might have been the best ruler in Chinese history. So he inherits the throne, and he's got a huge problem on his hands. Many scholars won't take the test to get a government job because they don't want to work for Kongzhi because he is not Chinese. So he's got to recruit the scholars. So he's trying to figure out, how can I get the scholars to respect me and work for me. So his idea was, well, if I want the scholars to respect me, I need to become a scholar myself. So Kang Ji begins to study Confucianism in depth, for instance. He begins to support the arts. He begins to support education. He begins to support literature. He becomes a scholar himself. This is Kang Ji on the screen. Notice in the background, right, bookshelves full of books. In his lap, there is a book. This is a piece of propaganda, letting the scholars of China know, hey, I am one of you. Yes, technically I'm not one of you because I'm Qing, I'm Manchu, but I value learning. I value scholarship. I value Confucianism. Please work for me. Please, for the good of your country, please come work for me. And eventually it works. Eventually, many of the scholars do take the test and they pass the test and they come to work for him and come to respect him. And he becomes a very well-respected ruler, similar to Akbar, once again, of the Mughals that we studied last chapter. And like Akbar, he also tolerated Christianity. Christian missionaries started to really come in during the reign of Kang Ji, and he was okay with that. He didn't mind that. And some high-ranking court officials actually converted to Christianity. Now, unfortunately, eventually us Christians, we're going to get kicked out of China because we brought all of our drama with us, and we started to argue amongst each other, and our new converts started to argue. So eventually the Chinese government's like, you Christians, you're nothing but drama, so get your stuff and get out. Now we come to Emperor Qianlong, right? And he reigned for a very long time, and most of his reign was very successful. But by the end of his reign, you begin to see the signs of internal decay. Remember that cycle we saw, where there's a new dynasty, and at first the dynasty is very well ran, but eventually, corruption increases, taxes increases. That's what happens. In the later years of Qianlong, he comes under the influence of corrupt court officials, royal court officials, and there are soon signs of internal decay. Peasant unrest again, right? Taxes going up again. And then, right, the Europeans are starting to show up in more and more numbers wanting to trade with the Chinese, right? Now, the Chinese, from their perspective, the Europeans don't have anything that they want. So if the Europeans want to trade with China, they actually have to pay for the right to trade with China. So the government of Qianlong begins to sell trade rights, but then they put heavy restrictions on the Europeans. So the European traders could only come to one island right off the coast of Guangzhou. Right? So they couldn't even come on mainland China. They could only come to this one island off the coast of China. And those European merchants could only come there October through March, and while on that island, only deal with certain people. Right? As far as Qianlong is concerned, you don't have anything I need. In fact, that's what he said. I have no need of your country's manufacturers, which is a fancy way of saying I don't need your stuff. Right? You trade with us or don't, we don't really care. If you want to trade with us, you got to pay us for the right to trade with us. You can only come to this island off the coast of Guangzhou, and you can only come October through March. This probably was not the best idea of Qianlong. Probably what would have been better was free open trade with the Europeans and a free exchange of ideas. Because what starts to happen is as Europe is rising, it has the scientific revolution, it's making industrial advancements, China begins its slow decline. Right? So China is still at this point where it views itself as literally the center of everything. Cheng Cao, the Middle Kingdom, right? And all other people are barbarians, including the Europeans, but the roles will soon switch. Give it about another century, and the Europeans are going to come to dominate Southeast Asia and begin to boss China around, just like China used to boss the Europeans around.